Hey guys, and welcome back. I'm Georgia, and sometimes I talk about true crime, sometimes I talk about history, and today we've got a really fun history episode. I have had this idea on my list for literal years, and I'm so glad I've finally done this because I've learned so much in the research process for this video. This is a comprehensive history of birth control. Okay, maybe it's not that comprehensive. Turns out there's a very long and very complicated history when it comes to birth control, but I've tried to include as much as I possibly could. I always find myself going down rabbit holes in my research, and I had to pull myself out of so many rabbit holes in this process because let me tell you, this could easily have been a 10-part series. I promise you, this is such an interesting topic. Because the history of birth control is really a history of people. It's people fighting for the freedom to choose how, when, and whether or not they want to have sex and reproduce. It's about people reclaiming their bodies, reclaiming their pleasure. And actually, talking about reclaiming pleasure, today's video is sponsored by Lilo. Yes, Lilo. I am so excited about this one because I have been an avid Lilo customer for years. Lilo has been the luxury pleasure brand for over 2 decades, but they're not just a sex toy brand, they're a self-care movement. They know that satisfaction transcends gender, orientation, race and age. I just love this brand and everything they stand for. Lilo makes luxury pleasure products designed to put you at the centre of the experience. And one of my absolute favourites is the Sonar 2 Cruise, which uses sonic waves, not vibrations, sonic waves, to stimulate the clitoris, even the parts you don't see, for deep sonic pleasure. It's very soft, it's waterproof, it's made from body safe silicone, it's super easy to clean, and it doesn't lose intensity when you add pressure thanks to the cruise control tech. She's really, really good. Really good. Think of Lilo and their products as self-care because pleasure should feel personal. It should feel empowering and never something to feel weird or awkward about. Like, how far has the world come? A century ago, you couldn't even say the word sex in public without causing a scandal. And now here I am on the internet talking about sex toys and sharing the entire history of birth control. Shame? I don't know her. So if you're curious or if you're looking for a reason to explore more, Lilo have got up to 50% off right now, and with my code GM15 you can get an extra 10% off. I lied, it's 15% off. You get an extra 15% off. Okay? Cool. The link is in the description if you want to go check it out. You should. Treat yourself. Spoil yourself. And now let's get into the history of birth control because pleasure and choice have always been connected. So I would usually go back to the very, very beginning, but with something like birth control, it's really hard to pinpoint where that beginning is. Like, at what point did humanity become aware that sex equals pregnancy? At what point did they realise that it was something that could be prevented if that is what they wanted? According to anthropologists and evolutionary biologists, all of the evidence available to us seems to suggest that humans have understood there is some kind of relationship between sex and pregnancy since Homo sapiens started to show greater cognitive development, and that was about 200,000 years ago. It's knowledge that we take for granted now, like duh, obviously that is how babies are made, but if you think about it deeper, it's fascinating because no, there's not really an obvious immediate connotation that sex equals babies. There's a long time usually between sex and the symptoms of pregnancy, sometimes weeks. So how did it click? It was probably through watching animal behaviour and also eventually realising that women don't tend to get pregnant until they've slept with men. But the humans at this time wouldn't have thought about it in biological processes. They wouldn't have had any concept of the whole egg and sperm situation. That didn't come until 1875. I was shocked when I realised it was that recent, but it does kind of make sense. A lot of medical advancements happened in this time. Up until that point, people knew that sex equaled baby, they just had no idea why. Like, was a woman simply an incubator for the male seed, or did she produce a seed of her own? Was it to do with the moon, or astrology, or magic? Like, as somebody whose body makes her acutely aware of every single step of her menstrual cycle, like, I get a twinge and I know I'm ovulating. It's wild to think of a time when women didn't have that knowledge. I suppose there's many women out there now who don't have that knowledge. But it's crazy to me that all of these things happen to women every single month for the entirety of history, but only really for the last 150 years have people known why. But regardless, for as long as we have history, people have tried to prevent pregnancy by all kinds of means. They didn't know how it happened, but they knew they wanted to stop it sometimes. I did originally write at this point in the video a whole thing here about how pregnancy works, how a woman gets pregnant, but it just felt very patronising because if you've clicked on this episode, I can only assume you know how pregnancy works. So I am just going to continue assuming you know the process of conception. Okay, if you don't, give it a Google, come back here, but I'm sure you do. As is often the case with history, some of the earliest methods of birth control come from ancient Egypt. Birth control was likely or definitely used before this point in whatever form, but the Egyptians were just really good at documenting things, so we know a lot about ancient Egypt. We have medical texts from them that date back thousands of years, showing methods combining their knowledge of plants with spiritual beliefs and also practical techniques. Some of the earliest examples of birth control were found in the Ebers papyrus. Ebers papyrus? Ebers? I don't know. Around 1550 BCE, there's evidence of the use of pessaries, so basically things inserted into the vagina to try and block the passage of sperm. Women would take things like honey, acacia gum, dates, even crocodile or elephant dung and mix them into this thick paste to be inserted into the vagina. Real sticky substances. And you know what? It kind of did work, obviously, otherwise women wouldn't have used it so much that it was literally documented by the Egyptians. This created a physical barrier, number one, stopping the sperm from physically reaching the egg, but also acacia ferments into lactic acid, and that has been proven to have spermicidal properties. It literally repels sperm. There were also all sorts of herbal remedies used in this time, things like sulfium, pennyroyal, rue and juniper, all mixed into teas or paste to stop pregnancy. Silphium is a now extinct plant that was believed to contain a compound that interfered with ovulation or thickened cervical mucus, literally stopping the sperm from reaching the egg. It worked in a very similar way to how the pill does nowadays. A lot of these plants are thought to have worked in very similar ways, acting perhaps as abortifacients rather than birth control. Am I saying abortifacients right? Haven't said it out loud before, might be wrong, but basically some of these would cause contractions to stimulate the uterus into shedding its lining or just into creating a generally hostile uterine environment. An egg couldn't grow into a baby. I'm not going to go into the whole argument of abortion here, if life starts at conception, etc, etc. I am pro-choice. I believe a woman shouldn't have to be pregnant if she doesn't want to be, and that is kind of where the line is for me. Even if life does start at conception, a woman shouldn't have to be pregnant if she doesn't want to be. But we're here to talk about birth control. In an ideal world, we want a woman to be able to control not getting pregnant at all. This isn't about abortion. This is about stopping that sperm from reaching the egg. Of course, the use of these plants wasn't really monitored at the time. They don't have data and statistics, and I doubt they were effective 100% of the time, but they worked well enough to be documented in the Ebers papyrus. Another big birth control method that would have been used a lot in this time is what is hilariously referred to in a lot of the texts I read as coitus interruptus, the withdrawal method. Again, this makes it very clear that humans had some idea of the processes of sex and how they led to pregnancy, even if they didn't know sperm and egg, especially amongst the more educated in society. They knew that if a man pulled out before finishing, a woman was less likely to be pregnant. The withdrawal method has long been used. It is still used now by many, although don't rely on it because it is not that effective. Remember, the same societies that were using this withdrawal method also used magic and amulets and fertility spells to prevent pregnancy. They tied symbolic charms around the waist. There were prayers being made to goddesses like Isis. As a forever skeptic, a forever atheist, I am hesitant to believe that any of this praying the spiritual things worked as an effective contraception method. Perhaps it worked in conjunction with other methods I've just mentioned, but this was a very spiritual society. They believed that these things worked to an extent. Many of these methods were based on observational knowledge and trial and error, and as you can probably imagine, it was nowhere near as reliable as modern contraception. And also sometimes it was just downright dangerous. I can't imagine sticking dung up inside you had any positive health benefits, and I can imagine it led to a lot of infections. Moving on to ancient Rome and ancient Greece, they used many of the same plant methods as the Egyptians, but there's also evidence of lint-soaked tampons being used in an attempt to block sperm. Materials like wool and cloth would be soaked in various things like olive oil, honey, or acacia gum to either repel or block sperm on its journey. Today we know that olive oil would have been mildly effective because of its spermicidal properties, but I doubt language like that would have been used back then. They just knew that this made a difference. The cloth would be soaked in whatever substance they were using before being inserted into the vagina to act as a barrier, both spermicidal and physical. It was a physical barrier that was likely the more effective thing, and the substances probably assisted, but again, I can't imagine it was healthy for the woman. Also importantly, you probably realise already, but all of these methods I've mentioned do not protect against STIs, and we know that history was riddled with STIs. That came a little bit later. Also, probably another important thing to note here is that these methods of contraception, especially in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, were likely used much more amongst the wealthier women in society who would have had the access to such materials. Women in the lower classes or enslaved women wouldn't have had the money for things like soaked tampons. They might have had access to the plant-based remedies, but we're going to see this same thing, the same theme, again and again and again throughout this video. The wealthier in society can afford to have more control over their fertility. Poorer women have fewer options for birth control and therefore less power over their lives and their futures. And then they're going to be looked down on for this, when in reality it's been a deep societal issue for as long as records have existed. We have records of it in ancient Rome. You can open social media and see the same now. Attitudes towards women never change. But anyway, let's talk about condoms, which thankfully have changed a lot over the last couple of thousand years. The earliest known evidence of a condom-like device comes from ancient Egypt, of course. This obviously wasn't rubber or latex as we would know a condom to be now, but instead made from animal bladders or maybe even linen. Ouch. However, goat or sheep intestines seem to be the most popular for use here. These intestines would be cleaned and dried to make a very crude protective covering for use during intercourse. You can imagine the texture. Like, I can see why this is something they would use for this, but also no, no thank you. And nowadays condoms are thin, they're discreet, there are no big seams on them, they're comfortable. You can imagine that using sheep intestines for this, it wasn't the same. Also linen. Linen makes even less sense in my brain than using intestines. I mean, the linen apparently would be soaked in oil before insertion, but still, no, it feels rough. Greek and Roman texts refer to much the same again, animal intestines or linen sheaths dipped in oils or medicinal substances. It's unclear whether the intention behind these sheaths was necessarily contraception or pregnancy prevention, or if it was more at this point to maybe prevent disease, but I can imagine it would have been okay for both uses. Not great, but I can imagine it did something, otherwise they wouldn't have used the same method over and over again. There are a lot of historical mentions of the use of animal skin to protect against diseases, but maybe not as much mention of protection against pregnancies. The first documented use of condoms in modern Europe seems to be around the 16th century, once again most likely made from animal intestines or linen, or maybe even fish bladders, as is mentioned in some texts. All of those hundreds of years, over 1,000 years since the first mention of condoms in historical texts, and the basic idea hasn't evolved that much. Again, it leads you to believe that it must have been somewhat effective. In this time though, condoms were used to protect from disease, specifically syphilis, which was rampant in Europe during this time. Syphilis has been a problem for so much of history, but once again at this point, condoms were only really available to the wealthy. They cost a lot of money. The wealthy could protect themselves, but the poor just had to get syphilis and the cycle continued. Although saying that, I can't really imagine these condoms were that helpful at preventing syphilis because they were reusable. reusable condoms that were rarely properly cleaned. Moving now into the 18th century, so a couple hundred more years, we saw a distinct turning point in the use of the condom, especially in Europe. There was now a bit more of a knack to how the animal intestines were used here. They were cleaned, processed, dried, and then moistened before use to soften them, make the whole thing a bit more comfortable. But it was a whole thing. Like, it took a long time to use one condom. Sometimes they'd be tied off at the end, kind of like imagine a balloon tie, but other times they were just left open. Again, which is kind of effective for preventing against diseases, not so much for actual birth control. And they were still reusable, but they could be washed and dried after use. Again, you'd have to be really thorough at washing and drying them to prevent disease. And this time they didn't really have a concept of how diseases were really spread. So again, was it that effective? A little bit, maybe. And at this point, around the 1700s, their usage was much more widespread. You could buy a condom at an apothecary, a street vendor. There were even specialised condom shops in places like London or Paris. But in this time, they weren't often called condoms. They were more likely to be referred to as sheaths or even English riding coats. I would love to know where that came from, but you can see English riding coat. Despite being a bit more widespread, a bit more available, there was still a big taboo around talking about condoms in open society, and they were mostly associated with sex work and immoral behaviour. But still, they were becoming more commonplace, just little wins. But then we move into the 19th century, we come into Victorian Britain, which was very uptight. There was this big focus on morals, moral behaviour. The Obscene Publications Act was first introduced in 1857 and it formally criminalised the distribution of any materials related to sex, including contraception. This act stayed in place well into the 20th century, probably into our parents' lifetimes, and it gave courts the power to seize and destroy any materials deemed to be obscene. Only the problem is they didn't provide any clear definition of what exactly obscenity was. This act wasn't aimed at birth control, but that kind of became a natural consequence. Any talk of sex was seen as obscene. I mean, even medical or public health documents would have to be censored to avoid offending people's sensibilities. The use of condoms at this point was completely stigmatised, and women having any form of access to birth control was especially transgressive. Contraceptives were painted as being responsible for moral decline. You should only be having sex if you're married, and if you're married, you can have children. Why would somebody need birth control if they were only having sex during marriage? Now, of course, women who are married also deserve equal access to birth control as much as an unmarried woman, but that was not a discussion that was being had in this time. It actually wasn't really until the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 1970s that these laws began to soften and access to contraception became normalised and, more importantly, legalised. And of course, condoms being banned in this time, being illegal in this time, didn't mean that people didn't use them, but they were just a lot harder to get hold of. There was a lot more stigma and people were less likely to use them because of this. People were, of course, still having sex and lots of it outside marriage, but now it was just less safe. So that's what was going on here in the UK, but what about over the pond? Turns out, very similar. In 1873, the US enacted the Comstock Act, named after a self-appointed moral crusader called Anthony Comstock. This was a federal law passed by Congress to prohibit the mailing of any obscene material, any article or instrument of immoral use, including contraceptives and abortion information, and any information about preventing conception. This was much more explicit than the UK law in that contraception was directly named in this act and it was banned. There was no room for interpretation. And the condom in particular was stigmatised, and this delayed any advancements in sexual education by decades. But by the turn of the 20th century, it was becoming more important than ever to have a reliable form of birth control. The Industrial Revolution meant that the world was changing rapidly, and many families were forced to move into the cities to work. Living costs rose, space was super limited, and it became completely unsustainable for families to have lots of kids. Women at this time were joining the workforce in higher numbers than ever because they had to. But frequent pregnancies made it impossible. It was very much a catch-22 situation. They're having more kids, they need to work, they need more money, but then they have more kids because there's no access to birth control. It was a whole thing. To fit in this new industrial world, women needed to have control over their reproduction. And this was a key point of suffragettes and feminists in this time. And also remember at this time as well, and throughout most of history, pregnancy was really, really dangerous. Many women in their lifetime would fall pregnant a dozen or maybe even more times, and there was always, every time, a high risk of maternal death and stillbirth. And even if a woman did survive, she would be exhausted and malnutritioned. Malnutritioned, is that a word? Maybe, you know what I'm trying to say. It became increasingly clear that contraception wasn't just this moral issue, it was actually healthcare. Without reliable birth control, women were tied to motherhood. Without reliable birth control, women were forced to turn to back alley abortions because they simply couldn't afford another mouth to feed. They already had 8 children back home, they couldn't feed a 9th. Bodily autonomy was directly linked to economic and political freedom in this time, and people were slowly beginning to realise that. Contraception at this point wasn't just about stopping pregnancies, it went so much deeper than that. It was about women having freedom. Women were being forced to have birth because they were told that contraception was immoral, it was evil. But when the children were actually born, there was no help for them. And that might sound similar to some things that are going on today. Maybe. So at the turn of the 20th century, with all these realizations coming to a head, the person at the head of the charge was a woman called Margaret Sanger. And honestly, I could do a whole video on her alone. But while she was considered a pioneer 100 years ago, today she is considered to be somewhat of a very controversial figure, but most historical people are. Margaret Sanger was born in 1879 and she came of age at the peak of the Comstock Act, that federal statute in the USA that criminalised contraceptives. She had grown up watching her mother get pregnant time and time again, forced to give birth 11 times and suffer through 7 miscarriages, getting sicker and weaker with each conception and eventually contracting tuberculosis. Margaret, who was 19 at the time of her mother's death, had seen this throughout her entire life. She had watched her mum get pregnant again and again and get weaker with each and every one, and she vowed never to allow it to happen to her or to other women if she could help it. She soon fled to attend nursing school and then got a job as a visiting nurse on the Lower East Side in New York City. And what she saw there in the city just further solidified her resolve, because she saw her mother's own story reflected back at her time and time again in the poor immigrant women that she was looking after. They just had pregnancy after pregnancy with no way to feed the children that they were being forced to carry. And what happens when contraceptives are banned, abortion is illegal, and a woman gets pregnant? Dangerous back alley abortions. Margaret would be called out time and time again to care for these women who had botched abortions, and she soon turned her focus away from the actual nursing care and instead towards activism, to fighting the root cause. She wanted contraceptives to be available to all women. She wanted women to be in charge of their own bodies, of their own fates. Margaret Sanger famously said, "No woman can call herself free until she can choose consciously whether she will or will not be a mother." In 1914, Margaret published 8 issues of her feminist magazine called The Woman Rebel, and this was the first of its kind, featuring literary pieces on women's rights, women in the workplace, reproductive education, sexual education, and so much more. It discussed the issues that regular working-class American women faced, and Margaret urged that regular women to fight against their oppression, to become the woman rebel. She wanted to empower women to fight for their own freedom. And it was in one of the issues of this magazine that Margaret Sanger became the first person to coin the term birth control, which is obviously a term we still use today. She was going to do anything to see through her mission, and soon she began to provide women with information on sex, because in this time many women were uneducated. They had no ideas how their bodies worked, how sex worked, how the menstrual cycle worked, and how pregnancy happened. Margaret believed that a little bit of education would go a very long way in empowering these women. but also they needed the tools, they needed actual contraception. In 1915, she was indicted with sending diaphragms in the mail, a dome-shaped barrier device inserted into the vagina to block sperm. It was very simple, it was effective, and it was legal. But Margaret, of course, was not deterred. The next year, in 1916, she was arrested for opening the first birth control clinic in the USA, the Brownsville Clinic in Brooklyn, New York. This perhaps wasn't a clinic as we'd think of it today, but it was a place where women could come and learn about birth control, sit face to face with experts of the time. It immediately proved to be so popular, but it would only be open for 10 days because the Comstock Act very quickly shut it down. But this would be the first step towards what would eventually become the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, Planned Parenthood. And although this clinic was shut down very quickly, it generated a lot of publicity. A lot of women learned about contraception and birth control through the media around this controversy. I can't say that's what Margaret Sanger planned, but she must have known that the clinic wouldn't be open for all that long. As I mentioned earlier though, Margaret Sanger is today seen to be a controversial figure. She believed that crime, criminals, disabilities and prostitution was purely the result of high birth rates, children being born to families with too many children. One of her biggest arguments for birth control was that it would reduce the number of unfit people and improve the health of the human race. Yeah, she was heavily associated with the Eugenics movement, which was a popular belief in the late 19th and early 20th centuries aimed at improving the genetic quality of the human population. It involved promoting reproduction between people who were deemed to be fit to reproduce and discouraging or even preventing it amongst those deemed to be unfit, something which was often judged on race, disability, poverty, and all kinds of other discriminatory factors. Now, Margaret Sanger wasn't the world's biggest eugenics advocate by any means, but she did publicly support what she called voluntary eugenics, encouraging people to make sensible reproductive choices based on health and fitness. Although she did explicitly denounce forced sterilisation, she didn't believe in that, so that was something. A lot of people did believe in forced sterilisation. As I always say, try not to always view history through a modern day lens. From a 2025 standpoint, it would be very easy to villainise Margaret Sanger. But then she also did so much good. Nothing in history is black and white, everything kind of sits in the grey. In the early 1900s, eugenics was considered to be modern science. It was very progressive. Nowadays, we know different. For a long time, Margaret Sanger dreamed of a magic pill that could work as contraception. Over the next few decades, she wins legal victory after legal victory, fighting for women's reproductive rights. But still, birth control options were pretty limited. It was pretty much just the diaphragm and the condom. She knew how valuable these things were, especially the diaphragm, but it was also awkward to use, it was expensive, and most women were too embarrassed to use it. She knew there had to be something better. She spent years trying to turn her idea of a magic pill into reality. She wanted a contraceptive pill that was as easy to take as aspirin. She knew it was possible, but such a thing needed money, a lot of money, and Margaret didn't have that. So she teamed up with an incredibly wealthy woman called Catherine McCormick. Catherine was a suffragist and a biologist. She was on the front line of this fight with Margaret, and she donated over $2 million in today's money to fund the research that eventually led to the pill. The pill was originally backed by two women. I mean, I suppose it would have had to have been because no man was ever going to think to do this. You see, by the early 1900s, scientists had begun to understand the role of hormones in the female reproductive cycle, realising that progesterone could prevent the release of an egg and therefore prevent pregnancy. And in the 1930s, biologists Gregory Pincus and Min Chu Chang began experimenting with this, proving for certain that progesterone could cause ovulation, in animals at least. It was possible, they knew, but it was still so far off. But then in the 1940s, scientists synthesized progestin from an extract of Mexican wild yam root using some crazy science, and finally the idea of actually stopping ovulation became a reality. They had this synthetic hormone, they had the animal testing to prove that it worked, and now they just had to test it in humans. In the early 1950s, Margaret Sanger introduced Gregory Pincus to a man called Dr. John Rock, a gynecologist and fertility expert from Boston who advocated for women's reproductive health. He was also deeply religious, he was very deeply Catholic, so his entire thing was kind of a contradiction, but he hoped that the church would ultimately accept a pill because it used a natural hormone and didn't destroy a fertilized egg. It didn't kill anything, it didn't abort anything, it just stopped ovulation. Famously, as we know, the church did go on to reject the idea, but he wasn't to know at this point in time. The idea was that Pincus would handle the sciencey part of the pill, whilst Rock would handle the patients. And in 1951, initial human tests began with a group of women already under Rock's care in Boston, and he reported success. So, with more funding from McCormick, they expanded to large-scale trials in Puerto Rico and Haiti by 1956. But of course, this is history and things are never just nice and easy and ethical. Puerto Rico was chosen specifically for this trial because of its high birth rate, overpopulation concerns, and lack of any strict regulations. Access to birth control was already legal in Puerto Rico at this time, and it was a US territory, so trials could be conducted under US jurisdiction, but with fewer regulations. It was a loophole. But the population was largely poor, Spanish-speaking, and had limited education, making it much easier for researchers to recruit test subjects. Most women here didn't exactly know what they were signing up for, raising serious power and consent issues. The participants here were not told that the pill they were taking as part of this study was experimental, nor that they were a part of a clinical drug trial. Most of the women here believed that they were just receiving a new, safe form of routine birth control, not a high-dose hormonal experiment barely tested on humans. The pill tested at this time, called Inovid, had 10 times the hormone levels of today's versions of the pill. 10 times. Progesterone-only pills today can cause side effects like acne, mood swings, weight gain, changes to libido, even ovarian cysts. Any woman who has been on any pill at any point in her life is going to be able to tell you the list of side effects that she suffered. I know back when I used to take the pill, it took me 2 years to finally find something that worked for me with relatively few side effects. The thought of taking a pill with 10 times the amount of hormones I was taking back then makes me want to scream cry. I can only imagine. Many women at this time reported severe nausea, dizziness, blood clots, and depression, and 3 women even died during the process of the trials, but autopsies weren't performed, so we can't say if Inovid was the direct cause. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe not. And of course, the men in charge of this study, Pincus and Rock, would just dismiss the complaints from these women, minimising the reports of the side effects. Bearing in mind, these were the men who were at the forefront of the fight in women's reproductive health. These were practically feminists in the eyes of this time. But even they still continually dismissed women. Their single rationale was that despite all of the side effects, the pill was actually doing what they wanted it to do. It was preventing pregnancies. The Puerto Rico trials are one of the main reasons why we have access to the contraceptive pill today, but it also became a case study in bioethics classes all around the world. These women were used here without any true agency. I have lost count of the amount of unethical medical trials I've covered on this channel over the years. Just when you think there can't be any more, there's always another one that I find. There are so many. But yeah, the trial did do what it needed to do. It proved the effectiveness of the synthetic progestin in preventing pregnancy. And after this trial concluded, the pill entered a new phase. It became one of the most influential pharmaceutical products in all of modern history. I mean, the pill is such a success story, it is so widely used around the world, that it is the only drug to have such a name, the pill. If you tell somebody you're on the pill, the likelihood is that they know exactly what you're referring to. You're talking about the contraceptive pill. Off the top of my head, there's no other drug like that I can think of. I'm sure I'll be corrected in the comments, but I can't think of anything else. Like, the pill. That's it. You don't even need to expound on it. You say the pill, people know what pill you're talking about. In May 1960, the US Food and Drug Administration approved Inovid for use as the first oral contraceptive, containing 10 milligrams of northianadrel, which is a synthetic progestin, and 0.15 milligrams of mestranol, which is an estrogen. This was a huge amount of hormones, which meant that it was very effective at preventing pregnancy, but it was also very medically risky. Women saw frequent side effects, including nausea, headaches, mood swings, weight gain, and blood clots. But still, the pill spread quickly around the world. It transformed reproductive autonomy in so many countries, although of course its acceptance and availability worldwide varied based on religion, politics, class, feminism, sexual liberation movements, and so many other things. In the United States, the pill was adopted incredibly fast. By 1965, 6.5 million American women were using it, but it was initially limited to married women who only wanted control over their reproductive rights. If you gave it to unmarried women, they thought they were just going to use it as a chance to be promiscuous. Gasp. It wouldn't actually be made available to unmarried women until 1972. Here in the UK, the pill became available on the NHS in 1961, again only for married women, before being available to all from 1971. France legalised contraception in 1967. It was available in Germany, region dependent, from the 1960s, but the more Catholic countries resisted. Ireland banned the pill until 1979, and even then it was only available for menstrual regulation, and very similar in Italy and Spain as well. Latin America, which was also strongly Catholic, had very complicated access. Many of the governments did accept the pill as a way to slow population growth, but it was often used as a form of eugenics. Rural and indigenous women were often coerced into taking the pill to stop them giving birth, whilst the women in the urban centres would be looked down upon and judged for taking it. The pill was approved in Canada in 1961 for therapeutic reasons, the same in Australia and New Zealand, but it was very restricted by cost. It was crazy expensive. In China, the pill became part of the one-child policy from the 1970s. It was very easy to get hold of in China, but the use wasn't always voluntary or well-informed. Use throughout Africa varied depending on religious, urban-rural, or economic divides, and Western-funded family planning clinics did try to promote pill use, but it wasn't always viable. The problem with the pill is that you need to take it every single day, or sometimes with a week's break every 3 weeks, so you need to kind of be stocked up on it, you need to have a supply, and when the nearest family planning clinic is miles away on foot, it's not always going to be easy to get a hold of. It's very easy to think of things like the pill from a very Western perspective, but it's fascinating to see the use vary from country to country, how some countries or governments embraced it whilst others rejected it entirely. But let's not forget that those early versions of the pill were chock full of hormones, causing horrible side effects. By 1969, there were the pill hearings in the US Senate where women testified before Congress about their experiences with the pill. And this is where the FDA mandated that all oral contraceptives come with a patient information leaflet, which was the first time this was required for any drug. You know the leaflet with the incredibly long list of side effects, which has become somewhat of a meme at this point? That's why we have it. They were like, we're not going to change the side effects, we're just going to make sure people know about them. But only if they read this really, really small text in this really massive leaflet. Luckily though, as the years went on, new formulations of the pill emerged with, thankfully, much lower hormone levels. Today, there are 2 main types of pill. The first one being the combined oral contraceptive pill, which contains estrogen and progestin. This works by preventing ovulation, so it stops the egg from being released. It also thickens the cervical mucus, preventing the sperm from reaching its destination just in case an egg was released, and by thinning the uterine lining, which stops implantation in case everything else didn't work. There are multiple different dosing schedules for the combined pill, the most common being monophasic, where you basically receive the same hormone dose every single day. There's also biphasic with 2 different doses in the cycle. There's triphasic, which you might guess is 3, and this most closely mimics the natural cycle. There's extended cycle, where you have fewer withdrawal bleeds every year, or continuous use, where you have no placebo pills in a month, you just skip your period entirely. The standard combined pill will generally feature a week's break or a week's worth of placebo pills every single month. And on the pill, you don't get a proper period because you're not ovulating, so there's no egg to shed, but you get bleeding caused by a sudden drop in hormone levels. And by taking this week's break each month, it stimulates that, it makes that happen. But there's actually no medical necessity to have the 7-day break or have a monthly period or withdrawal bleed whilst you're on the pill. The week break in combined pills was actually designed for social reasons rather than medical. In the 1960s, when the pill was first being introduced, they wanted it to mimic a natural menstrual cycle as much as possible, to reassure women that their bodies were still working normally and they were not pregnant. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, one of the creators, Dr. John Rock, was an incredibly devout Catholic, and he hoped that this would make the pill more acceptable to the church. It didn't. The Catholic Church rejected the contraceptive pill entirely and all forms of other artificial contraception on moral and theological grounds. The Church teaches that there's an inseparable connection between sex and procreation, and according to Catholic doctrine, every act of sexual intercourse must have the possibility of procreation. They're very okay with natural family planning apparently, but anything artificial, like the pill or IUDs or even condoms, are bad. Now, not every Catholic follows this thinking. Apparently it's a bit controversial even within all the Catholic leaders. What are Catholic leaders called? Bishops, maybe? But that is the official stance. My camera battery just ran out, so I'm back like 3 hours later. But I was about to say, so every time you take your combined contraceptive pill and you take that week break and you have a period, a withdrawal bleed, whatever you want to call it, know that that is not medically necessary. You don't have to do that. You can just keep on taking it. That is what I did for many, many years when I used to be on the pill. And I'm fine. But anyway, the combined pill is only one type. The other type is the progestin-only pill or the mini pill. And as this name suggests, this contains only progestin. It works by primarily thickening the cervical mucus, so it basically stops any sperm from getting through, and it might also suppress ovulation, but that depends on the exact formulation of the pill that you are taking. And this one is generally reserved for women who can't take estrogen, so women who might have migraines or clotting disorders, or maybe they're breastfeeding. Also, if you just don't want to be taking estrogen, this is the pill for you. Some women just don't respond well to having extra estrogen in their body. It's all very individual. But this pill is one that must be taken at the same time every single day for it to work. You've got to be very on it. There's a little bit more of a leeway with the combined pill. This one, you've got to be very organised. You've got to know what time you're taking it and you've got to do it. Otherwise, it's not going to work as well. I read for some of the pills there's like a 1 hour window you've got to take it, some have 3 hour windows, some have 6 hour windows, but generally you've got to take it at the same time every day. And we also have the emergency contraceptive pill as well, which aren't exactly regular birth control, but they can be included in the same category. Think things like the morning after pill or Plan B, which can be used after sex to stop a fertilized egg from implanting itself in the lining of the uterus. All in all, the invention of the birth control pill has been revolutionary for women's reproductive health. The pill was a transformational moment in the feminist movement of the 60s and the 70s. It wasn't just this incredible medical breakthrough, it gave women bodily autonomy, economic liberation, and sexual freedom for the first time really in history. As we've seen throughout this episode, before the pill, women had very limited control over their own bodies. I mean, with the way politics currently are, many women still do have very limited control depending on where they are in the world. But the introduction of the pill essentially allowed women to take control of their own lives, for the first time to be able to plan their own lives. They could now attend university or higher education without the risk of unplanned pregnancy. They could delay children and therefore delay marriage and have more power over their own careers, meaning they could compete more equally in professional spaces. Studies in the US showed that access to the pill directly increased women's participation in higher education and in the workforce, especially in fields like law, medicine and business, which are always so male-dominated. And this led to legal battles over workplace discrimination and equal pay, because one of the main arguments male employers always had over employing women was the concern of pregnancy. Why hire a woman if she's just going to get married and get pregnant and have to take time off? The pill made the argument much more difficult because the risk of unplanned pregnancy was so much lower. Of course, life was still made hard for women who did want careers and children, for actual family planning still is, but the pill generally just made things, I'm not going to say an even playing field, because even today it's not even, but a bit closer. The pill was also a great fuel for the sexual revolution of the 60s. It made non-marital sex safer and more common. It shifted the entire narrative of female sexuality from being this passive act, sex was something that men did to women being able to take an active part in their own sexuality. They took power over their sexuality. But as many feminist pros as there were to the pill, there were also the cons. We know that the early pills had incredibly high hormone doses, causing very severe side effects, and doctors and science just didn't really care. It was doing the desired effect, it was stopping pregnancy, but was it worth it? I mean, still today we know that the pill has so many undesirable side effects, and yet it is still offered to women like candy in certain parts of the world. A lot of the time you go to the doctor and the first thing they'll do for any sort of ailment you've got is try to put you on the pill. They'll be like, you're a woman, it's hormones, go on the pill, that's it. It is ridiculous. Also nowadays, straight women are almost expected to be on the pill. They are expected that if they are having sex with men, they need to be on the pill. They are solely responsible for contraception. Whereas it is something that works both ways. And also the birth control pill does not protect against STDs. It's kind of taken the burden of responsibility completely away from the men. If a woman gets pregnant, it's on her, and the man is just allowed to go about as normal. For protection against STDs, STIs, we need condoms, and I've spoken about them historically at length up until this point, but the truth is, by this time, the mid-20th century, condoms were just not that popular. At the same time as Margaret Sanger's fight for the birth control pill, there was also a lot going on in the world of condoms as well. I think I left it last speaking about them in the 18th century, but in the 19th century came the invention of vulcanized rubber, and that changed the game. With vulcanized rubber, they no longer had to use animal intestines as birth control. There was something a bit sleeker, a bit more comfortable. Still not great, granted, but we're getting there. When World War I came around, the American and British armies were sent off to the trenches without a single condom, whilst the German army was sent with plenty of them. Now, you don't think sex is going to be a big priority for people at war, but people are always going to find ways to have sex, and when there's loads of men going through horrific things, they want sex. They were having a lot of it. By this point, people knew about the condom's ability to prevent venereal diseases, but it wasn't really deemed a financial priority to provide condoms to the soldiers going to war. And also, a lot of the army, the government, they kind of morally objected to this idea, because if they provide condoms, that's basically seen as them being like, yes, sex is good. Sex outside of marriage is good. Go and do that. So they didn't. And as a result, it was found that when the British and American armies returned home, they now had an epidemic of syphilis and gonorrhea to deal with. The soldiers came home having picked up STIs abroad. They slept with their wives or their girlfriends, they got new girlfriends, and it just spread like wildfire. The government and the army very quickly realised that they should have just sent the soldiers with condoms in the first place, because that would have been a hell of a lot cheaper than trying to cure an entire nation of syphilis. Not that if they sent them with condoms, there was any guarantee the men were actually going to use them, because at this point they were still made of very thick vulcanized rubber, they were bulky, they were uncomfortable, and importantly, they were still reusable, which isn't the best for STD prevention, but still, it was something. It would have helped somewhat. So in the 1920s, latex is invented, and condoms would soon become what they are today, with an incredibly high tensile strength that can be stretched up to 8 times before they break. Straight girls, that boy telling you that the condom isn't going to fit him, he's lying. It will fit him. It will always fit him. So during World War II, they sent them off with plenty of condoms, and there were much fewer reports of STDs, proof that condoms really do work. But even with the invention of latex, of condoms being produced in higher amounts than ever before, they still weren't that popular. They were stigmatised, they were associated with sex work and loose morals. You only needed to use condoms if you were sleeping around with people who weren't your spouse, because sex is only for procreation, of course. If you were found to have condoms, That said a lot about you as a person. The condom companies originally started selling them as disease prevention devices, not birth control, to avoid violating laws like the Comstock Law. But this didn't necessarily help with popularity because, again, you only needed disease prevention if you were sleeping around. But regardless, by the mid-1930s, condoms were the most popular form of contraception in the US, mostly thanks to a US court decision in 1936, finally allowing doctors to distribute contraception and even talk about contraception. But we're saying the most popular device. Not many people use contraception, generally. So being the most popular out of a small population didn't really mean that much. But as we moved further into the 20th century, they became more widely used. They were still very discreet, but people started to slowly use them. And then we know what happened. The birth control pill got popular and condoms, once again, fell by the wayside. The contraceptive responsibility fell to women. Men didn't have to worry about it anymore, and people just forgot about STDs. Enter the 1980s and the HIV/AIDS crisis. In 1981, the CDC published its first report on a rare type of pneumonia that seemed to be popping up in young gay men, which would then be identified as HIV/AIDS in 1983. I have an entire episode about the AIDS crisis. It's actually one of my favourite videos I've ever made. So if you want more details about all this, I'll link it down below and on screen right now. But essentially what happened, after many years of being ignored by the government and very little funding, it became clear that HIV was sexually transmitted, most commonly through unprotected sex, and it seemed to be absolutely booming in gay men. Why? It wasn't inherently because they were gay, it wasn't a punishment from God as so many people loved to preach at the time. It was actually due to biology, to science. A lot of gay men have anal sex, but the lining of the rectum is much thinner and more fragile than the vagina, making it much easier for HIV to enter the bloodstream. It can also be transmitted via vaginal sex, of course, but it just spreads a lot easier through anal sex. That, and the fact that condoms were not widely used at this time due to the fact that most gay men just saw them as pregnancy prevention that they had no use for, meant that transmission risk was just biologically higher. Also, there was no testing and no public health campaigns for AIDS until years after the virus started, so it just spread like wildfire before anyone even knew what was going on. The Reagan administration in this time didn't publicly mention AIDS until 1985, and by that time thousands had died and hundreds of thousands more were infected. The plain truth is, if this disease had affected heterosexual men as much as it did gay men, it wouldn't have taken Reagan 5 years to acknowledge it. 5 years. When people did finally start paying attention to HIV/AIDS, it became very clear that there was one very effective way to stop transmission. Or not stop because it's never 100% effective, but to slow down transmission a lot. It was condoms, simple yet effective. And so, for the very first time in history, condoms were openly advertised, openly promoted for both STIs and pregnancy prevention, and the adverts for them became explicit and educational. There was no longer the Comstock Act, there was no more beating around the bush. This is what they were for, and this is how to use them. This is how to be safe. It was a matter of public health at this point, and although it would have been much helpful many, many years earlier, now finally they were being spoken about in plain terms. And it was mostly due to LGBTQ+ activist groups pushing for this wider availability and wider education. They really, really fought for this. And eventually it did work. As a big old lesbian, I do feel like it would be a miss here if I didn't also talk about dental dams in this video. I know this is technically about birth control and lesbians, well, we don't need to worry about birth control, but STDs are still a concern. The two are very intrinsically linked, so I'm going to talk about them. Dental dams are essentially a condom for oral sex. They're a barrier method. They're a thin, flexible sheet originally invented for dentistry, but a century later, during the AIDS crisis, it was also found to have other great uses. Lesbians also wanted to protect themselves from STDs, and dental dams were repurposed for this. They were also distributed by LGBTQ+ activist groups as part of safe sex kits, and Planned Parenthood also added dental dams to their educational material. Planned Parenthood had come a really, really long way since Margaret Sanger in 1915. But still, despite this, you don't come across dental dams very often. education. They never quite took off in the same way that condoms did, but they are an option for safe sex that are worth mentioning in this video. If you're a lesbian, look into it. Or even if you're not a lesbian, there are so many uses for them. So, going into the 1990s, condom brands across the Western world embraced this super bold marketing and started targeting the youth. Now, don't get it twisted, we're not talking about targeting children, but teenagers, teaching them safe sex education in schools, normalising condom use from an early age. Teenagers are always going to have sex, so at least teach them how to be safe with it. Around this same time, fun condoms also became more popular as well. Different textures, flavours, colours. It turned it into a whole fun experience. But still, at this time, still now even, many religious and conservative groups oppose the education around condoms, instead preferring abstinence-only education. The abstinence movement really took a hold in the early 1900s because whilst you had some people like Margaret Sanger really fighting for more reproductive rights, you also had the other side of the coin with sex education mostly focusing on morality and purity, or the dangers of promiscuity. Now, obviously, this messaging varied country to country depending on politics and religion, but abstinence only was a massive thing. It was the standard in the USA, although it did waver a little bit as the sexual liberation movement rose and comprehensive sex education became more popular. But then from the 1980s and the AIDS crisis came around the Reagan era moral majority. They started fighting against comprehensive sex ed. In 1981, the US Congress passed something called the Adolescent Family Life Act, which was federal funding specifically for abstinence until marriage education. Programs became required to teach that abstinence was the only way to avoid pregnancy and STIs, which, yeah, technically is true. But there are also so many other ways to protect yourself and not just live in fear. As we all know by this point, abstinence-only education does not work. Numerous studies have proven that these programs don't delay sexual activity, they don't reduce teen pregnancies or STIs, and instead they just promote misinformation and shame. All that's happening is that teens are having sex anyway, but instead of being safe and sensible, they have no idea what they're doing and just end up in situations. It's really interesting to look at the sex education policies in the US versus the UK in this time. Sex education in the early 20th century was shaped by Victorian values, strict modesty and restraint. But whereas abstinence was discussed as an option in this time, even then in the UK it was rarely taught as the only option, at least not outside of religious settings. In the 1990s, when it was found that the UK had one of the highest teenage pregnancy rates in Western Europe, the Labour government put in place the Teenage Pregnancy Strategy, which explicitly rejected abstinence-only education and instead focused on comprehensive sex education, on support services and access to contraception. And what happened as a result of this? Well, government research subsequently found that open and honest sex ed hugely reduced the risky sexual behaviour, and the teenage pregnancy rates started to trend downwards. Although it actually was really interesting to find out that it was only in 2020 that the Department for Education made relationships and sex ed compulsory in all secondary schools in England. That is wild. 2020. I must admit, I don't really remember my sex education in the noughties being particularly well done, but I am 31 years old now and I've never been pregnant, so maybe sex ed worked, or maybe it's the lesbianism. No way of knowing. As a quick side note, as of 2020 in this new curriculum, all sex education here in the UK must now include LGBTQ+ content as of secondary school. So that's LGBTQ+ relationships and identities must be represented in the education, and students must learn about diverse families, stating that inclusion is not optional. As a gay kid who grew up under Section 28, you have no idea how much this fills my heart. Again, that's not really birth control, but it feels relevant. I finished school in 2012. I left school, and not once in all my years of sex education did they ever mention anything other than straight sex. Not once. Which means when you're a little gay kid, you're just going into these experiences completely blind. Nowadays, there are so many options for birth control. Still today, the contraceptive pill is the most iconic and most widely used form of birth control in the Western world, But as we know, it has its drawbacks. It's a daily responsibility and it has sometimes awful side effects, putting the onus entirely on the woman, whilst a lot of the time the man doesn't want a baby either. But if a woman forgets to take a pill and gets pregnant, it's on her. So what are some other options? First up, there's the IUD. There are some concepts similar to IUDs dating back as far as the early 1900s, but as you can probably imagine, they're not nice, they're very crudely designed, very dangerous. And it wasn't until the 1960s that the first modern plastic IUD was introduced, which was called the Lips Loop, developed by Dr. Jack Lips. He wanted to develop a cheap, effective, non-hormonal form of birth control because, as we know, not everyone can deal with the hormones of the pill. The Lips Loop was a serpentine loop made of polyethylene plastic that came in all sorts of different sizes. It was inserted through the cervix into a woman's uterus, with the idea being that it triggers a local inflammatory response in the uterine lining, increasing the levels of white blood cells, prostaglandins, and enzymes that basically damage or destroy sperm as it comes in. It interferes with the sperm's mobility, ultimately preventing fertilization of the egg. And if fertilization did happen, this would prevent the egg from implanting. And it was actually wildly effective for this time. It was 96 to 98% effective as long as it remained in place. And it could stay in place for almost a decade. So if the Lips Loop worked for you, it was great. But many women found that they didn't work for them. They caused intense cramping, spotting, and infections. On the back of this, many other people also started designing IUDs, one of which was the Dalcon Shield. Now this one was not good. It was not like the Lips Loop. This was invented in 1968 and was soon marketed as a safer, more effective type of IUD. It was this kind of like plastic spider-like shape with all of these arms sticking out, which they said meant it was much less likely to fall out or fall out of place. To me, it actually kind of looks a bit like a stingray. It has this nylon filament string that hung out the bottom, out of the cervix into the vagina. And this, it would turn out, was a fatal design flaw because all this nylon string did was wick bacteria up into the uterus, which is, unsurprisingly, supposed to be sterile. As a result, huge amounts of women found themselves suffering with pelvic inflammatory disease, or PID, which very soon led to infertility, miscarriage, sepsis, and even death. Over 2.5 million women used the Dalcon Shield, and at least 200,000 of these ended up filing lawsuits. And remember that not every person affected by this would file a lawsuit. That was a huge statistic. It became this huge scandal when it was found that the company behind this, the A.H. Robbins Company, became aware of the dangers of the Dalcon Shield very early on by 1973, but they just ignored them. Women being ignored in a health setting. Classic. Time and time again, the company ignored clinical warnings and downplayed all of the risks in adverts. They endangered women time and time again. Even when they found out that young women who had never given birth were much more vulnerable to these complications, they continued to market it specifically to young women who had never given birth. It was awful, and eventually the Dalcon Shield was pulled, but this was a massive scandal that led to just generally a huge mistrust of IUDs. Women didn't just stop using the Dalcon Shield, they stopped using IUDs altogether. Apparently they never got as popular in the USA again. I would leave that up to my American viewers to talk about in the comments, but they're still a really popular form of birth control in China apparently, in Scandinavia, in Latin America. I also feel like they're fairly popular here in the UK, although I do hear horror story after horror story of implantations. Doctors are very determined that there are no painkillers required or anaesthetic required because the cervix has no nerve endings. Apparently it shouldn't be painful. It is painful because of course women can feel things going on down there. Will women's health, women's pain ever be taken seriously? Apparently not. The injection, the depot injection, is also another very popular form of birth control developed again in the 1960s. It's one injection every 3 months. It contains a synthetic form of progesterone and it works in a very similar way to the progestin-only pill. This is 94% effective with normal use and 99% effective if you use it perfectly. But it's very hard to judge because some people just metabolize faster than others do. The injection does have the standard side effects, weight gain, mood changes, headaches, and it can often cause irregular bleeding or can stop periods entirely, which is either great or annoying depending on your preference. It can also cause a very delayed return to fertility, so once you come off the injection, it can sometimes take up to a year for regular ovulation to return. But it is a very low maintenance birth control. It's very discreet, it's very non-invasive, but it is also an injection. Once it's done, you've got to wait it out, even if you have terrible side effects. You can't undo the injection. There's also the implant as well, a small plastic rod which is about 4 centimeters long, inserted under the skin of your arm that slowly releases progesterone, stopping the ovaries from releasing an egg each month. The implant can last about 3 years and is 99% effective, but as soon as you remove it, your body returns back to normal. Like, there's no lingering side effects. You can get pregnant straight away. Also, I generally find whenever I hear somebody suffering terrible, horrific, awful hormonal side effects of birth control, I always seem to find it's the implant they say they're on, but maybe that's just personal experience, personal anecdotes. I've never used it myself, but friends. That's what I've heard from friends. I will be really fascinated to hear all of your experiences with any sort of birth control in the comments. Have you used the implant? Did you suffer horrible side effects? Did you suffer nothing? Let me know. Finally, there are also things like patches which can be stuck to you and changed weekly. They sort of slowly release hormones through your skin. There are also things like the NuvaRing, which can be inserted into your vagina monthly, but you rarely hear about these. I don't think I've ever heard anybody use the NuvaRing or the patches, but they are an option. They offer very steady hormone levels, and you, the user, have much more control over them. You can stop or continue to use them to your heart's desires, but they are generally less popular. I think people want to think less about birth control, not more. And when you've got a patch, it's very visible. When you've got a NuvaRing, you have kind of got to think about it a little bit. People want things that are more subtle, more discreet, that they can just put to one side. But then again, so many people use the pill, and that is a daily pill, so maybe not. Bar condoms, women are the ones who tend to always hold the burden of responsibility when it comes to birth control. They are the ones expected to initiate and manage contraception most of the time. There's this long-standing social norm that pregnancy prevention is the woman's job. But they also bear the physical side effects of this as well, which is sometimes horrific. I used to be on the pill many years ago, and it took me 2 years to find one that finally worked for me. I personally was on Yasmin for a short amount of time, and it made me so incredibly depressed. It terrified me. I know how awful these side effects can be, and luckily when I came off Yasmin, I immediately went back to normal. I think in the end, microgynon was the pill that worked for me for many, many years. But also I know that pill causes awful side effects in so many people. So it really is just a test. You've got to keep trying all these different pills. It might give you terrible side effects until you finally find one that works for you. But it is such a journey. It's such a faff. Faff doesn't even cover how annoying it is. So much of birth control nowadays assumes that men are passive participants in reproductive responsibility, that male involvement in sexual health is seen as optional. And yes, whilst women are the ones running the risk of getting pregnant, it does take two to tango. Women face all of the side effects, and there's not really any equivalent level of contraception. Women face all the side effects, and there's not really any equivalent level of contraception that exists for men. And this imbalance has never really been addressed. There have been decades of research into male hormonal contraception, but each and every advancement has been shelved somewhere along the way because of concerns about the side effects that men might suffer. The very same side effects women have to tolerate every single day. But God forbid a man goes through it. God forbid. There are massive costs to women bearing the burden, not just physical, but mental and economic too. Birth control costs money. You've got to attend doctor's appointments or go to clinics to be prescribed it. You've got to deal with the complications. You've got to add on further doctor's visits, further mental and physical energy. Despite there being 2 people involved in the making of every pregnancy, women are the ones blamed for unintended pregnancies, even if they did do everything right. Men often don't believe they have any burden here, that they could wear condoms, but they're just so uncomfortable. However, even simple things like deeper education about reproductive health, about the female reproductive system, could make a really big difference here. It really could help even that burden out. I truly do believe that everything in life, so many world issues, come down to just needing better, more comprehensive education about whatever that thing is. Men don't understand the reproductive cycle. Men often don't understand everything women have to go to prevent pregnancies. And I feel like that can be easily evened out. Whilst sex education is so much more comprehensive here in the UK, the boys generally don't need to learn that much about the menstrual cycle. And I think that should change. So yeah, that is the history of birth control. Going into this, I really didn't think it would be such a big topic, which was probably naive in hindsight. But I was like, that sounds like it'd be fun and quick to write. And 3 weeks later, and here we are. So much time and energy and research went into making this. And honestly, I had a lot of fun. So please leave your comments down below with your birth control experiences, with your thoughts and feelings, your birth control fun facts. I know I didn't cover every single angle here. Like I said at the beginning, this could have been a 10-part long series, but I feel like I got most of it. I got the big stuff. So please talk to me, leave your comments, engage, interact, all the YouTuber things, and please, please, please make sure you check out Lilo in the description box. Making videos like this wouldn't be possible for me without sponsors like Lilo, and I love the brand so much. I'm such a big fan. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.